July 1945, the war is still going on, there was a major study, secret of course now, public, declassified. There was a major study of the State Department and the War Department which warned of what they called a rising tide all over the world, wherein the common man aspires to higher and wider horizons. You know, that's what underlies the threat of ultranationalism. Now, what about Russia? They said, well, Russia hasn't yet demonstrated where it stands with regard to this rising tide, but we don't have any proof that Russia has not flirted with the thought of associating with these dangerous currents. They haven't yet demonstrated clearly that they haven't flirted with that thought. Therefore, we can take no chances, and the study recommends that we have to surround the Soviet Union with military bases, everywhere, and also deny them any access even to warm water. We deny them even any control over the Dardanelles, their one warm water access. The planners who proposed this were concerned that this proposal might look illogical, but they concluded that it's what they called a logical illogicality. You got to think about that. The reason it's a logical illogicality is that our benign intentions, we being the United States and England, our benign intentions can be taken for granted. I mean, it's just obvious. But in the case of the Russians, there's still a possibility that they might flirt with the thought of associating with the aspirations of the common man to higher and wider horizons. No fear of that for us. We're not going to do that. But they might, and therefore it's a logical illogicality. Now, it should be stressed that right through this whole period, Stalin's crimes, his awesome crimes, which were well known, were of absolutely no concern to Truman and other high officials. Truman wrote in his diary that he liked Stalin and admired Stalin. He thought it would be a catastrophe if Stalin died. He described him as honest. What happened in the Soviet Union was none of his business, he said. Other leading figures agreed. All that Truman required, as he put it, was that the United States get its way 85% of the time. Other than that, Stalin could do what he felt like at home. And that's, again, standard, exactly as with a host of other murderers and torturers of lesser scale. The unacceptable crime is disobedience. And again, I stress that same is true of priests who preach the preferential option for the poor, secular Islamic nationalists, Islamic fundamentalists, democratic socialists, or any kind of independent variety. That's the logic of the Cold War, exactly as it's the logic of the North-South conflict generally. Now, Russia was so big and powerful that this particular case of the North-South conflict took on a life of its own. But other than that, it falls into the general pattern. And with the end of the Cold War, we can predict pretty confidently, and could have 10 years ago, that the consequence will be exactly as in every other case. So take, say, at the opposite extreme, Grenada. We managed in the nick of time to save the United States from destruction by Grenada, invading it and overthrowing the government. Grenada was then going to become a showcase for capitalism and democracy, as you remember. The United States poured in aid. It had the highest per capita aid in the world outside of Israel, which is a special case, doesn't count. And this was going to show, how benign and wonderful we are. You can have a look at Grenada today. It's a total ruin. Almost. There's one part of the economy is successful. There was a front-page story in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago saying that it's not a total catastrophe. I mean, it's true, hunger's going up and everybody's unemployed and, everything's falling apart and so on. But there's one good thing. Grenada has the highest number of banks per capita of any country in the world. Now, a bank means a little office somewhere with a computer and a fax machine. Since Grenada has no laws or anything like that, a bank can call itself, Grenada, using this office, and it doesn't have to worry about taxes or reporting profits or regulation or anything. It can launder drug money, can do anything it feels like. This does create some employment for, a couple of dozen lawyers or something. And that's the one part of the Grenadian economy which is in fact flourishing, apart from that total disaster. And very much the same story happens over and over again when the ultranationalist threat is crushed. I don't have to give you examples, it's entirely standard. And we can see exactly the same process going on in Eastern Europe. If you look at the economy of Eastern Europe relative to the West, it was declining up until about using UN figures, it was declining up until about 1913. It then increased pretty sharply relative to the West up till about 1950. Then it was sort of stagnant, stable relative to the West. By the 60s, it was beginning to decline, but still pretty much stable into the 1980s. In 1989, it went into free fall. Now it's just a catastrophe, typical third world catastrophe. And in fact, it is returning to a third world structure. The typical third world structure is a two-tiered society with a sector of extreme wealth, often unbelievable wealth, linked to foreign investors and so on, and a huge mass of people living in total misery, and that's the direction that Eastern Europe is going. And furthermore, again, predictably, the sector of extreme wealth is to a large extent the old Communist Party. The guys who knew how to run things. If you're opening a McDonald's franchise or something or other in Russia, or a GM plant in Poland or whatever, you turn to the people who know the ropes, who have the connections, who know how to do things, and they're usually the ex-nomenklatura, the old Communist Party. And in fact, what's developing there, quite predictably, is what Martin Willicott in the Guardian the other day called nomenklatura capitalism. The ex-party hacks discovered that you can't maintain power by beating people over the head yourself, so you therefore beat people over the head for the foreign investors, who are quite happy to have somebody who knows how to do it for them. And we're now moving into the standard third world pattern there, exactly as you would expect. Well, the return of this vast region to the third world, where it belongs, has great effects on the West. In fact, it offers new weapons against the population at home in the Western societies as well, because it can function exactly the way the rest of the third world does. And the business press has been kind enough to point this out quite lucidly, so let me quote from the international business press. Take General Motors, world's biggest corporation. It's closing down 24 plants in North America, United States and Canada. It's already the largest employer in Mexico, taking advantage of what is called the economic miracle of the past decade, which has driven wages down by 60%, offering all sorts of new opportunities for profits. It's also opening plants in Eastern Europe. So the London Financial Times, about a year ago, had a front-page story on a new $700 million high-tech plant that GM was opening in East Germany with high expectations. The reason is that there's huge unemployment, and they can get workers there, skilled, trained workers, for 40% the wages of the pampered West European workers. Okay, I'm quoting. So, and furthermore, they don't have to offer them benefits, and they'll work longer hours, and all the problems caused by the pampered West Europeans they can forget about. Well, other corporations get the same idea, and there's another article in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago pointed out, I'm quoting, thanks to rising unemployment and pauperization of large sectors of the industrial working class, as the capitalist reforms proceed, you can now get workers for a tiny fraction of the wages of the pampered Western European workers in Poland for 10%, not 40%. And the wages are kept down that way by the government's tougher policy on labor disputes, as the Financial Times puts it, meaning their ability to break strikes. With trade unions shackled by law and subdued, unemployment high, and the EC social chapter rejected, so that employers are protected from over-regulation and under-flexibility of labor. So there's green shoots in the UK as well. And of course, Americans have to learn the same lesson. The basic idea has been quite clearly expressed by business leaders. For example, Harry Gray, who's the CEO of United Technologies, major U.S. conglomerate, who explained about 10 years ago that we need a worldwide business environment that's unfettered by government interference, such as package and labeling requirements and inspection procedures to protect consumers, meaning that the overriding human value, the only real human value, is profit for investors. Everything has to be subordinated to that, and the government isn't supposed to interfere to prevent that development. Now, Harry Gray doesn't object to certain kinds of government interference. For example, the kinds that keep his corporation alive. The corporation's an offshoot of the Pentagon system. It's publicly subsidized, wouldn't exist if it wasn't for a vast public subsidy fed through the Pentagon system. And that's typical. The neoliberal rhetoric is to be very selectively employed as a weapon against the poor. The wealthy and the powerful will continue to rely on state power, as they always have done back to 17th century England. So under the Reagan years, for example, needy mothers with children, for them, aid declined rapidly, but aid for needy executives rose to new levels. That actually is in this context, we can understand quite well what the current so-called trade agreements are about. Agreements like GATT, or in North America, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, what they're intended to do, and again, this is said pretty frankly, is to freeze in place these developments so that in case there is what's called a democracy opening, that is, the danger of some democratic movement developing, people won't be able to modify these successful institutional structures. Once it's written into international treaties, they become quite hard to change. And one can easily understand why democracy is so feared, not only in the third world, but at home as well. And there is a theory about it. Again, it's not a secret. The theory has always been, I'm quoting, that the general public are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders who must be put in their place. And their place in a democracy is to be spectators, not participants in action. Since it's a democracy, they have a role. Their role is to select, to lend their weight to one or another member of the responsible men, as they're called, representatives of private power, so they can lend their weight to one or another of these representatives to lead them every once in a while. That's called an election. And then they're supposed to return to their personal concerns. They are the ignorant and incapable mass of humanity, as Robert Lansing put it, Wilson's Secretary of State, and they have no other function. It's too dangerous to let them get out of their place. Well, that's the progressive end of the spectrum. I happen to be quoting from Walter Lippmann in his progressive essays on democracy. There's a spectrum. And at the reactionary end, we have, say, the Reaganites, who reject even the spectator role. Their picture is the population has no right even to see what's happening. The more liberal and open-minded people say they have a right to see but not participate. So when under the Reaganites, for example, you had unprecedented recourse to censorship, clandestine terror operations. They're clandestine to make sure that the public doesn't know about them. Clandestine operations are only targeting the domestic population. Everybody else knows about them. And a whole host of other devices to ensure that the powerful holy state is not troubled by the rabble. And Reaganite radical statists raised this to new peaks. Notice that these trade agreements like NAFTA and GATT provide a move towards the reactionary end of the spectrum. They create a system in which the public is totally unaware of the decisions that are affecting their lives. These agreements have large-scale effects but nobody knows about them. Very few people can have any idea what's happening in the GATT negotiations, let's say. You have to be a specialist to figure it out. And in that manner, that and other respects, we can approach what has always been the ideal, namely formal democratic procedures, but devoid of any threatening substance. So citizens not only do not enter the public arena, but scarcely even have an idea of the policies that will shape their lives, and don't even know that they don't know. The ultimate in destruction of democracy, carried to new levels in the New World Order. Well, always structures of governance have coalesced around concentrations of domestic power. In recent years in the West, that's been primarily economic power. And that process continues too. One major phenomenon of the past years, particularly the past 20 years, has been what's called the globalization of the economy, say shifting production to high repression, low-wage areas and so on, which accelerated a lot in the last 20 years. And that has consequences. One consequence is that, in fact, new governing structures are developing to serve the interests of the transnational corporations and investment firms that dominate increasingly the world economy. And again, the business press is quite frank and forthright about this. So about a year ago, the Financial Times in London, which is the world's best business newspaper, described in a lead article what it called the de facto world government that's taking shape with its institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, GATT, the G7 meetings, the EC executive, the European Community executive, and so on. These new governing institutions are to serve the interests of the transnational corporations and investment firms and so on, private economic power, so-called, of course, state-subsidized, which run the world economy. That's one consequence of the globalization of the economy, the creation of new governing institutions which have the inestimable value that they are that they're not only immune to public pressure, you know, this rising power of the masses and all that business doesn't influence them, but the public doesn't even know what's going on in them. Again, just as in GATT, you can hardly know what's going on inside the IMF or the World Bank. No way to find out, again, unless you're a specialist, and even then. That's one consequence of the globalization of the economy. A second consequence, very visible, you don't have to walk more than a few steps from here to see it, a very visible consequence of the globalization of the economy is the globalization of the third world model. That's a natural consequence of the globalization of the economy. If you can shift production to high repression areas, to these places where there's these green shoots, like huge masses of starving people and powerful police forces to keep them under control and so on, that makes a large part of the domestic population just superfluous for production. Incidentally, they're increasingly becoming superfluous for consumption as well. In a more national economy, you needed the domestic poor to sell your goods. So Henry Ford was a great innovator. He recognized that if he wanted to sell cars, he had to pay workers a living wage, so he actually raised wages. That was necessary in a more national economy. It's much less necessary in an internationalized economy, a globalized economy. Production can be shifted to high repression areas, and it can be directed to the international rich men, the wealthy classes internationally. Again, that's a lot easier in the modern period when things can shift around freely. Nobody knows whether this is really going to work, but that's the model that's developing. And a third consequence, of course, is that it's necessary to establish control of the ideological arena, and that's the reason for the doctrines that are proclaimed that I mentioned at the very beginning. Okay, well, let me just say a brief word about these so-called free trade agreements, which are a large part of the system of domination and control. I'll be very brief, but they're quite important, and one should think them through. Say take GATT or NAFTA. They are called free trade agreements. That's highly misleading. And by looking at how it's misleading, we can understand a lot about the New World Order. First of all, take the word trade. Trade is a very odd word to use for an international economic, a set of economic relationships in which, for example, for the United States, according to latest figures, about 40% of U.S. trade is within a single firm, meaning one branch of the Ford Motor Company in Mexico is shipping something to another branch of the Ford Motor Company in the United States. That's called trade. But that's not trade, in any serious sense, any more than if you own a grocery store and you shift a can of peas from one shelf to another, it's trade. It happens to cross a boundary, but other than that, it has nothing to do with trade. It's just centrally managed interchanges, centrally managed by a very visible hand inside huge corporate structures, which internally have no market properties at all. That's always been understood. Classical economic theory held that there was a kind of a free world sea, and inside it there were tiny little islands, like a mom and pop grocery store, which internally didn't go by free trade. Well, by now the islands are about the size of the sea, and the sea isn't free trade anyway. So what you have is centrally managed trade by huge corporate institutions. It has nothing to do with trade. Secondly, the agreements don't restrict themselves to trade in any traditional sense. So a major part of the current GATT negotiations has to do with what are called services, meaning finance, for example, and investment. The point is to open up third world countries to take over by Western banks, which will ensure that they'll never be able to develop national economic planning of the kind that enabled the rich to develop in the first place. That'll be undercut because their resources will be held and controlled by huge transnational banks based in the rich countries. Again, that has nothing to do with trade or freedom. A third relevant property, going back to Adam Smith again, if you read Adam Smith, you find that one of the foundations of free trade is what he called free circulation of labor. People can go anywhere. Well, nobody's even dreaming of that. So that's another, that incidentally is a point that the third world emphasizes constantly in the international negotiations, but the rich men don't want to hear about it, naturally, so it never even, there's no perception of that at all. A fourth, and again crucial point, is that the rich are opposed to free trade, even actual free trade, exactly as they always have been, except when they think that they can win the competition. I mean, Britain is a perfect example of that, historically. Britain was opposed to free trade right through the mid-19th century. It used highly protectionist measures and simply state force to crush the colonies, for example, to deindustrialize India, incidentally Ireland as well, and to create its own industrial superiority. By the time it felt it could win in the competition, by about the mid-19th century, it turned to free trade. The guy who's going to win is always in favor of free trade. And England more or less held on to free trade doctrines until about the 1920s, at which point Japan was starting to undercut British production, not incidentally by cheap wages, but by greater efficiency, at which point England just closed off the empire. The 1932 Imperial Ottawa Conference raised tariffs so high in the imperial system that Japan couldn't compete. Well, you're not going to win anymore, so free trade is out the window. And that's the way it continues. The same is true of every other country. The United States has it. If the United States were pursuing the principle of comparative advantage, the principle we try to impose on everyone else, the U.S. would still be exporting furs. That was our comparative advantage. We certainly wouldn't have a textile industry. Textiles were developed in the 1820s, and so by simply barring cheaper British textiles. The U.S. has a steel industry because British steel was cut out in the late 19th century. It has computers because the computer industry is publicly subsidized. In the 1950s, when computers weren't marketable, it was 100% subsidized by the public. Then when you could sell the things, public subsidy went down to about 50%. That's part of the Pentagon system, the U.S. system for concealing the fact that the public is subsidizing viable sectors of free enterprise. And in fact, the only sectors of the U.S. economy, virtually the only sectors, major sectors, that function are those that are publicly subsidized via some sort of trickery or other, often the Pentagon system or the space agency or whatever. And the same is true of every other developed country. I mean, up to, Japan, Germany, South Korea, you pick it. To my knowledge, there's no exception to this. There isn't a single example of a developed country that got that way except by radically violating these principles. And furthermore, they still violate them. So in the last 10 years, 20 out of the 24 OECD countries, the rich guys, increased their protectionism in parallel with, free trade bombast. The Reaganites leading the way very often. So under the Reagan administration, the proportion of U.S. imports subject to one or another form of protection literally doubled, went from 12 to 23%, and the same was true of other aspects of the economy. Furthermore, all of this is a crucial factor, as the UN and the World Bank have pointed out. It's a crucial factor alongside of Western protectionism, alongside of what are called structural adjustment programs of the IMF and the World Bank. That means imposing a free trade regimen on the poor. The combination of increased protection in the West and imposition of a neoliberal model in the poor countries, that's led to a doubling of the gap between the rich and the poor in the past 30 years, according to the UN Development Program. And it has also led to a huge flow of capital from south to north. There's just in the last 10 years, the flow of capital from the poor countries to the rich countries is, just for debt service alone, is about $500 billion, which is the equivalent of 6 Marshall Plans in today's dollars. You may have noticed that Oxfam called for a Marshall Plan for the third world about a week ago. Well, that's nice, but it wouldn't even touch things. There have been 6 Marshall Plans from the poor to the rich in the last 10 years, just from debt service alone. All of this is, in part, a consequence of the playing around with protectionism for the rich and free trade for the poor. Finally, the one leading principle of the Western countries, particularly the United States in the GATT negotiations, is to increase protection for what's called intellectual property. That means things like software and, crucially, patents. The idea is to guarantee that the multinational corporations will monopolize the technology of the future, including electronics and aeronautics and, crucially, biotechnology and so on, which means that they will monopolize the means of life, seeds, drugs, and so on and so forth. Well, again, that's crucially important, and I wouldn't say it has nothing to do with free trade. It's the opposite of free trade. It's increasing protection, and that's one of the leading doctrines of the Western countries, particularly the United States. In fact, if you look at these agreements, they're a mixture of liberalization and protectionism. They go far beyond trade, and they're designed for and by the rich men who are supposed to rule the world. The fact of the matter is that neither at home nor abroad does the real world even begin to resemble the dreamy fantasies that are now fashionable among the intellectual class about history converging to an ideal of free markets and democracy for which America is the gatekeeper and the model. Well, we can see the direction in which things are going if they're unconstrained. They can be constrained. There have always been conflicting tendencies. There are these tendencies. There are the tendencies of the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders to meddle more and to impede these processes and to take affairs into their own hands. In the last 30 years or so, there's been a very considerable increase in this throughout the world, and particularly in the United States, which I know best. Has been rather dramatic, in fact, though it doesn't have much in the way of institutional structure behind it. Both tendencies exist, as they always have. Which one prevails will determine whether there will be a world in which a decent human being would want to live.